Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we'll be summarizing the conclusions of our paper, The Size and Structure of Government, as well as reviewing the 7 major types of governments that we identify using our statistical analysis. As you recall from the paper, we wanted to see the extent to which governments change their size and structure in relationship to the complexity and overall volatility of the macroeconomic environment. Just as a reminder, we found that some governments change differently than other governments. Indeed, we found 7 groups or types of governments, which we will review now. The first group of governments we call the advanced resource-based growers. This group of governments tend to change their government's organizational size and structure in relation to the resources that they receive, but also in relation to changes in the macroeconomy. As such, this group can be characterized as having a mixed model or mixed approach of organizational structural change. And some examples of the governments in this group are Belgium, Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and Jamaica. Indeed, talking a bit about the regression analysis, which you will find in the paper, we found statistically significantly correlations to revenue to GDP, debt to GDP, and a geometric effect for our complexity proxy. Turning our attention to Group 2, which are the TaxGrow Economies, we find that these group of governments' size seems to be bound by the amount of resources that they raise. However, the heterogeneity of these countries makes generalization almost impossible about these governments. Indeed, we describe a little bit more specifics when we talk about groups 4 or 5, but I think for our purposes here, what we have to know about this group of governments is that they tend to tax and grow. And members of this group include Bhutan, Brazil, Canada, India, Moldova, Pakistan, Senegal, Tunisia, Turkey, and so forth. The third group of governments are what might be called environmental adapters. And these economies best exemplify what we mean by the contingency-based approach to organizational change. We find that the levels of government expenditure as a proxy for size, as well as rates of change of all parts of government, namely not only the size, but complexity and uncertainty of the organizational environment, tend to change in tandem. As such, we might conclude that these governments are most responsive to the organizational environment around them. And some of the governments are those that we might assume before conducting this study, like Austria, Denmark, Finland, France, Hungary, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Sweden. And we also find that there are significant interactions in the way that government deals with complexity and uncertainty, as well as the amount of such uncertainty and complexity. As such, these are the governments we might see as most responsive. Turning our attention now to the low-income tax and grow governments, you'll recall previously we talked about tax and grow governments, and we said that there are basically several groups of these tax and grow governments, and the first group we talked about, or Group 2, was very heterogeneous. In this group, Group 4, we find that the underlying theme between these governments are that they belong to the low-income group of countries. So we find that in general that the size and structure of their government changes primarily as a function to changes in their revenues. Examples of such governments include Côte d'Ivoire, Kyrgyz Republic, Madagascar, Mongolia, and Sri Lanka. Group 5 are the high-income tax and grow governments. Like we've been discussing before, these governments seem constrained in their size and structure mostly by the amount of revenue that they are able to collect. And some of these governments include Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States. Turning our attention now to the sixth group of country, we call these technological adapters. These governments tend to grow bigger as their economies grow more complex. So our hypothesis is that as the diversity of the economy in terms of structures or resources flowing between sectors changes, we also see changes in the governments as they try to adapt to these macroeconomic changes. Some examples of governments in this group include Bangladesh, Georgia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Oman, Peru, and Thailand. In the final group of countries, we label them as the risk-averse social insurance governments. We find that these governments' size correlates strongly with changes in the sectoral distribution of national output, and as such, this correlation suggests an organizational strategy which seeks to minimize economically disruptive effects of asymmetric shocks between sectors. Some members of this group include Australia, Belarus, Czech Republic, Ireland, Estonia, the Baltic Republics, Russian Federation, and Slovak Republic. So stepping back a little bit and asking what this means about the organizational strategy of the public sector in general, this strongly suggests that it's not possible to generalize. We have to look at each government, we have to look at its objectives, look at changes in its macroeconomy, and decide which governments have different strategies and how each of these theories from organizational theory, which we describe in the paper, helps us to best understand these overall changes. This has been another episode of Infographic Instant with Brian Michael.